The strange thing about Hanover was that it was legally bound to be indivisible, so it could not be split up among any heirs, and its succession was to follow male primogeniture, and that meant that Monty was fighting for his own personal claim to Hanover, not just for the land, but for an actual claim to being the lawful Holy Roman Emperor. And if Britain could make a separate peace with Hitler and turn around to help Germany defeat the Russians, then Monty would have won back both his ancestral lands as well as his title, at which point Bernard Law Montgomery would actually have been in the running with Hitler to become the Holy Roman Emperor, and it would have been difficult to find a more qualified candidate than Monty, because Hitler was, after all, just a commoner. When Napoleon had occupied Hanover, some Hanoverian officers and soldiers went over to London and became the British King's German Legion that would be an important part of the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Charleroi was 17 miles south of the Waterloo battlefield, and Brussels was 10 miles north of Waterloo, and the border with Holland was 40 miles north of Brussels, and Monty's genius plan had only one problem, and that was that the Americans were taking orders from Ike rather than from Monty. Holland was 195 miles long and 110 miles wide, and the North Sea was kept out of Holland with a system of dikes, or half the country would be underwater. Holland was the alluvial plain of the Rhine River, and the majority of Hollanders were of German descent because Holland had once belonged to Germany's Holy Roman Empire, and this had given them the nickname Dutch. The capital of Holland was called The Hague, from a German word that meant the Count's Hedge, and the granite in the dikes had come from Norway. And in 1920 there had been 107,000 people in Holland that could be called Jews. The American Mr. Carnegie had built huge buildings for the Dutch to house their courts of law after the Grand Conference of Peace there that had been called by the Russian Tsar in 1899. And the Tsar was the English king's cousin and the richest man in the world. And the Russian Tsar had only one main problem, and that was that he was keeping his money in the Bank of England. The Meuse River had been the border between the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France for over 600 years, when the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht was signed after Britain had made a separate peace after abandoning its allies in the middle of the war. And on the Meuse, halfway from Dinant to Antwerp, the river veered towards Germany at Venlo, and Venlo was a mere 2 miles away from the German border. From Venlo, the Rhine River was overland 24 miles east of the Meuse, and 30 miles downriver from Cologne, and Wesel was on the Rhine River another 20 miles towards the sea, and was 40 miles upriver from Arnhem. And Wesel had been a Prussian fort during the 7 Years' War, where the French had been allowed in after the Prussians had retreated. Wesel had been given back to Prussia at the end of the 7 Years' War, and Churchill and Monty crossed the Rhine and stood in Wesel for 30 minutes during their Operation Plunder, but they had to take a boat instead of using the only bridge left over the entire Rhine River, other than the bridge at Remagen, because while the bridge at Wesel had not been destroyed by British aerial bombing, Hitler had ordered Wesel's double-track railroad bridge blown on the 10th of March, 2 weeks before Plunder got underway on the 23rd. And that had been a surprise to Monty, because he knew that blowing the bridge at Wesel had not been Hitler's idea, but had to have been ordered by one of his thoughtful generals. By 1941, even the author of Gestapo Chief thought the Crown had run out of money. Churchill lavishly praised Roosevelt to his face. Churchill lavishly praised Roosevelt to his face and defamed him with the ugliest of accusations behind his back. The American president was a far more astute politician than Churchill, and certainly far saner. In order to support his war of vengeance, Churchill had to buy weapons from the United States, and Roosevelt stripped England of all her assets to pay for these. Only when England was bankrupt did Roosevelt consent to the Lend-Lease project and, in a moment of malicious humor, titled the bill 1776 when it was sent to Congress. Gestapo Chief, page 181 and 2. Churchill would write his opinion of the American war between the states as, "The Yankees were jealous of a style and distinction to which vulgar commercialism could never attain. They had no right to use the federal constitution which the great Virginian Washington and Madison had largely founded in order to bind the most famous states of the Union to their dictates. They did not understand the totally different conditions of Southern life. They maligned and insulted a civilization more elevated in manners, if not in worldly wealth, than their own. They sought to impose the tyranny of their ideas upon states which had freely joined the Union for common purposes, and might as freely depart when those purposes had been fulfilled." Churchill's History, page 465 and 6. As soon as Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, the U.S. immediately recognized the Soviet government. Russians had come from the West when Charlemagne was ruling Europe, and they were called rovers, from an old word that meant Russia. And they were first called Scythians, and Russia was called Sarmatia, and the Russians became Christians when Bulgarian missionaries brought Christianity north from Constantinople. When the Mongols showed up in Russia in the 13th century, they stayed for 200 years until Ivan III kicked them out. And all of China and Mongolia had belonged to the Khan, and Genghis Khan had killed all the Muslims in Baghdad before he died in 1227. The Mongols invaded Poland in 1241 and conquered Hungary, but when their leader died in 1242, they all headed back towards China. The grandson of Genghis Khan was Kublai Khan, and he was elected the Chinese king in 1260 right after invading Tibet. And Kublai Khan had his capital at Peking, Beijing. And after his death in 1295, the Mongol Empire would last only another 70 years. The Mongols had not liked the religion or the language of Poland, so they were not disappointed when they had to go home. And after the Mongols left Europe, the Crusaders were finally free to travel to the Holy Land again. The Russian Ivan IV conquered Siberia in 1547 and declared himself Tsar from the word Caesar. And Constantinople had belonged to Russia because it was where their state religion had been born, the Greek Orthodox Catholicism. But after Constantinople fell to the Muslims in 1453, the Patriarch of Constantinople would be renamed the High Priest of Moscow in 1561. As Caesar of the Roman Empire, Constantine had started the First Roman Reich in Constantinople when he converted to Christianity. And the Romans had forced the English to become Christians, and when the Romans left England in the year 411, England was divided into 7 parts, and these would not merge until Charlemagne put Egbert on the throne in the year 802. Egbert was the very first king of the savage English tribes, and St. Alban had brought Christianity to England, and St. Patrick took it to Ireland. And after the Romans left England, the heathen Vikings raided, but were stopped by Alfred the Great, even though the Vikings would come back later to make Sweyn their King of England for a few years. Alfred the Great started the University of Oxford and founded the Royal Navy in the year 897 to keep the Vikings off his blessed island. And England became united fighting against the Vikings instead of the English fighting among themselves. Vikings had traveled up and down the Rhine and taken their ships, up the Vistula and all over the rivers in northern Russia. and the Vikings had gone to Spain and to southern France, and they went to Genoa and Sicily and all the way up the Danube. And on their voyages they sailed past Gallipoli into the Black Sea, and up the Dnieper, and up to the Dniester, and up the Dniester, and they took their Viking ships past the Crimea, all the way up the River Don into the heart of motherland Russia. The Mongols had first attacked the Russians in 1223, and Russia was also suffering invasion from Vikings as well as Teutonic Knights. And Russians looked for spiritual strength towards their Orthodox Catholic Church in Constantinople that united the people of all the Russias. Tsar Nicholas II was called the Little Father, and he was revered as the leader of the Orthodox Church, and Nicholas II was married to a German woman named Alexandra, who'd been born in Germany and raised in England. And although it was a love match, Alexandra had not wanted to marry the Tsar because that meant she would have to become a Russian Orthodox Catholic, so the Kaiser had to talk her into it. England was planning war with Germany and needed Russia to fight on the Eastern Front. And the richest man in Russia was named Felix Yusupov, and his grandfather had been the king of Prussia. And the holy man Rasputin was warning Alexandra to stay out of the war, and after visiting London, Felix came back to Russia determined to kill Rasputin. Alexandra was devoted to this peasant holy man Rasputin, who saw visions of the Virgin of Kazan, and the Yusupovs had a palace in St. Petersburg, and in Moscow, and in Moika, and Kursk, and Kokaz, as well as estates on the Black Sea and the Bay of Balaclava, and a big one they didn't like on the Caspian Sea, around Baku, because for hundreds of miles black oil was seeping up through the dirt. Felix didn't have to fight in the Great War because he was an only remaining son, even though that law was meant to keep the farms going. And Felix's older brother had died in a duel right before his wedding when accused of having an affair with someone other than his fiancée, and he had to defend the honor of his mistress, and the jilted bride had been a fan of Rasputin. According to Rasputin's daughter, the holy man had been trying to help Felix with his personal problems, and Felix invited Rasputin to a wine cellar in his basement, and put the song Yankee Doodle Dandy on the gramophone, and fed Rasputin poisoned cake and wine, but nothing happened. Felix kept going up and down a small spiral staircase to the basement, and his friends were waiting up above in the study for news that Rasputin was dead. But the holy man just kept asking for more cake and wine. The poison was having no effect, so Felix finally shot him in the head, and the poison had been opium, and Rasputin had been given enough to kill a normal man several times over, but Rasputin had been no stranger to opium and had built up a substantial tolerance. And even with a gunshot wound to the head, he managed to crawl outside where they shot him again, and then carried his body down to the river to throw him in, but the river was frozen. So, after chopping a hole in the ice, they deposited the body, and several days later Rasputin's corpse was discovered, and an autopsy revealed that he had died of drowning because there was water in his lungs. When the Russian Revolution broke out right in the middle of the Great War, Tsar Nicholas II and his family were arrested and kept under armed guard until they were sent to Ekaterinburg in April of 1918 to a house with a wall around it. And the Russian nobility fled to Denmark. According to Vadim Petrov in The Escape of Alexei, the Tsar and his family were executed in a basement room at the Ekaterinburg house 2 months later, using handguns rather than rifles so as not to attract too much attention from the neighbors. The royal family had been told to get dressed and were taken to the basement because the whites were on the way, which was true, and that was given for the reason they were murdered. And Austrian soldiers had been sent to do the actual killing because the Soviets did not think that any Russian would participate in the murder of the royal family. On the 17th of July in 1918, The killers used a .30 and a 9mm Nagant, a .45 Smith & Wesson, a 28 and a 32 Browning, a 45 Colt, and a 32 Mauser, and they had been told to wait in the basement where it was safe until a car came for them, so they'd been given time to dress completely and gather their belongings for travel. Before long, a truck pulled up beside the house and raced its engine to cover the noise of the pistol shots, and the bodies were loaded onto the truck and driven down Ascension Lane. The truck had a 50-horsepower engine with 16 people riding in it, over roads completely made of mud, and it rained for the entire drive out to the old mine shaft where the Romanovs were to be disposed of, and the truck got stuck in the mud, so they buried the family in a shallow grave instead, and the intended mine shaft would later be searched, but all that was found was a dead dog at the bottom. 8 days later, the White Army crashed through the Bolshevik defenses around Ekaterinburg, and a detachment of monarchist officers raced to Ipatiev's house to free their emperor and his family. The building was empty, its interior a shambles. The Romanovs, Autocrats of All the Russias, by W. Bruce Lincoln, New York, Doubleday, The Anchor Press, 1981, page 747. In 1972, an electrical cable was routed through the grave 2.5 feet deep, but nobody saw any bones and only moved them around a little. And it would not be until 1991 that the Romanov grave was rediscovered and excavated, but it contained no skeletons of one of the girls and the little boy Alexei, and some of the bodies had their lower legs chopped off to fit into the grave. One of the men involved in disposing of the Romanov bodies said that 2 of the children had still been alive when they were loaded onto the truck. And he said that the executioners had intentionally avoided shooting the young ones, and posters had gone up all over Soviet Russia saying that anyone who sheltered the escaped Anastasia or Alexei would be in serious trouble, but the posters were quickly taken down when the Soviets realized it was a bad idea for anyone to know they had escaped, although people already knew, since word of mouth traveled fast in those days. Apparently, one of the guards had been the father of the 16-year-old Anastasia's unborn child, so the executioners had agreed not to shoot her, but the bullets had ricocheted and she was injured, and her lover managed to carry Anastasia away. But to cover the rumor that she had escaped, they came up with the following story. All were dead except Anastasia. Only slightly wounded, she cried out, more in fear than in pain. Unwilling to bother with reloading their weapons, the guards seized several rifles that stood nearby and calmly bayoneted her to death. The Romanovs, Autocrats of All the Russias, page 746. There had been 14 bayonet marks in the floor of the Ekaterinburg basement, and one version of the story was that a sister had fallen on top of Anastasia and that saved her. And it was said that there had been panic during the shooting as the room filled with smoke from the old-fashioned gunpowder, and the room was only 17 feet square, and the superstitious gunmen had reacted badly to bullets bouncing off the corsets of the women into which had been sewn a plethora of jewels. No matter the dire consequences of not following orders from the new Soviet government, the story persisted that one of the people transporting the bodies had secreted the youngest girl away, and that he'd taken her home with him to Romania, where his family nursed her back to health, and Anastasia was purportedly married into the Roman Catholic Church to this Alexander Tchaikovsky in Romania. They said that Anastasia gave birth to a boy in December of 1918, and that the Romanian Tchaikovsky family had been living off Anastasia's jewelry, and soon enough all the jewels were gone except for a pearl necklace that she'd been wearing around her waist. Her husband was robbed and killed while trying to sell it in Bucharest, and when he died, his brother took Anastasia to Berlin to reunite her with her aunt, but he quickly abandoned her, and his family had been glad to see her leave because she didn't know how to cook or clean or sew. Romania had been ruled by Germany until November of 1918. So Anastasia would have been considered the enemy had her identity become known. And she had also been given a death sentence in her homeland. So it would not be until the fall of 1921 that Anastasia dared to go to her aunt's house in Berlin for the reunion, well after it was certain that Germany had lost the war. In 1913, there had been 170 million people living in Europe and Russia, and 33 cities had a population over 100,000 people. And for every 300,000 businessmen, shopkeepers, and professionals, there were 2 million nobility, and that meant that 80% of the population consisted of rural peasants and factory workers, and in Romania alone, there were 175 palaces for the royal family and their retainers, while there were less than 200 schools for its 7 million inhabitants. As the story goes, Anastasia was taken to St. Mary's Hospital in Berlin in July of 1925, and she just turned 25 years old and had soft hands and good manners, and she still wore the swastika that had been a gift from her mother. Anastasia hated it whenever people would badmouth Rasputin, and she refused to talk to the doctors at St. Mary's because they were Jewish and she was afraid of Jews, believing them to be in league with the Reds, and she thought they would send her back to Russia. Anastasia was missing some front teeth and had 2 head injuries and a wound behind her ear and a skull fracture, and her jaw had been broken, and her arm and chest had been injured so badly that they were still festering, and one of her feet had a wound going all the way through it. Anastasia had some more of her teeth pulled out at the asylum and was given morphine freely, especially when her arm became infected, and they almost had to cut off her arm, but she only lost her elbow. The Princess Anastasia had grown up speaking English, and then German, and then French, and Russian had been her 4th language. And in Berlin in 1925, Anastasia refused to speak Russian except in her sleep. A friend sent her a song from a book of German drinking songs, and Anastasia said her mother used to sing it in English, and her mother had also kept a picture of Marie Antoinette on the wall. Without knowing much about this difficult person who had landed in their hospital, they called her the Unknown Woman or Mrs. Anonymous, and what made people most unhappy about Anastasia was her constant ingratitude. Anastasia was given a German passport and she sailed for America on the 29th of January in 1928 aboard the SS Deutschland that had first sailed to New York in April of 1924 and would be sunk in Lübeck harbor by the RAF in May of 1945. Anastasia changed her name to Anna Anderson when she became an American, and a great book detailing this story was entitled Anastasia by H. von Rathliff-Kielman, translated from the German by F.S. Flint and published in New York by Payson and Clark Limited in 1929, and it contained photographs taken by the author's wife that remain unpublished anywhere else. Anastasia had come to America exactly 6 months before it would be 10 years since her family had been killed, and that was the deadline for the Bank of England to be allowed to keep all her father's money. And in 1933, a court in Berlin ruled that the Tsar and his family were dead and that the Bank of England had none of the Tsar's money, an agreement among the bankers so the new Nazi government could start with a clean slate. After Hitler's war and the communist takeover and an earthquake that destroyed half of Bucharest in 1977, A search for Anastasia's marriage certificate would turn up nothing, and on the 27th of July in 1977, Brezhnev would have the Ekaterinburg house destroyed because it was becoming a shrine. In Russian, Anastasia meant the resurrection, and the Russian Orthodox Church would canonize Anastasia in October of 1981, making her a saint so people could pray to her for intercession and so she could ask favors directly from God, while the Reds had proceeded to expunge Christianity from Russia, but they would fail. From that crucible of suffering, agony, and death, Russia emerged more powerful than she had ever been, but the utopia envisioned by the men who had succeeded the Romanovs remained elusive and unrealized. And so it remains today. Quote, "Revolution is the mirror of the coming day," close quote, wrote the famous American anarchist Emma Goldman in 1924, the year of Lenin's death. Quote, "It is the child that is to be the man of tomorrow," close quote. More than 50 years later, there are many who wonder if perhaps Russia simply remains Russia, quote, "a whole world, self-sufficient, independent, and absolute," close quote, as the 19th century writer Mikhail Pogodin once explained, "a land in which, quote, everything is different," close quote. The Romanovs, Autocrats of all the Russias, page 748-9. The footnote 61 read, "Emma Goldman, My Further Disillusionment in Russia, New York, Garden City, 1924, page 178. And the footnote 62 was from an M.P. Pogodin book published in Moscow in 1874. The Romanov relatives refused to see anyone who had been in an insane asylum. The Romanov relatives refused to see anyone who'd been in an insane asylum, and they said that a Grand Duchess had no business being there, and they were also horrified that she'd given birth to a boy whose father was a commoner. In America, Anastasia married Jack Manahan, and Anna was invited to Richard Nixon's inauguration, but she didn't want to go. And Anna found an advertisement for a kind of wine that said, "If you drink a glass of this, you'll think you're Anastasia too." Aunt Irene had come to Berlin when she'd not seen Anastasia for 10 years, and this was the same Aunt Irene that Anastasia had gone to Berlin to visit in the first place. And when Irene came to dinner, Anastasia was suffering from a swelling in her chest that was festering, and she was still suffering from tuberculosis, and she was probably taking opium along with the wine, and Anastasia left the table in tears. When Irene was dying in the 50s, she allegedly admitted Anastasia's identity, but her family made the reporter who heard it turn off his tape recorder and erase that part of the tape, and Irene had told him that it was all the little things that had made her believe. The Anastasia movie came out in 1956, and a later British DNA test would claim that Anna was a fraud, and chances were that Alexandra's only boy child Alexei would have died from the hemophilia he inherited from Queen Victoria, although he probably had not survived the basement execution. Any Russian involved in the murder would have been guilty of a mortal sin for having contributed to the death of his anointed earthly sovereign. And despite any plan to have rescued the pregnant Anastasia or any aversion to shooting the boy child, the number of flying bullets had been a force of nature beyond human control. If by some miracle the boy had survived, the other relatives in line for the throne were not at all interested in having any heirs to the Russian Tsar re-emerge from the dark woods should world events take a turn in their favor, say, in the spring of 1945. The hemophilia gene was passed through the female line, and the disease was manifested in the males, and Edward VII had not been a bleeder, but his brother Leopold was, and Leopold passed it to his daughter, who gave it to her son. Victoria's first daughter did not pass it to Kaiser Wilhelm, but the second daughter passed it to her own daughter, who would be Anastasia's mother. And Anastasia's mother's brother was a bleeder. Victoria's youngest daughter, Beatrice, married the Duke of Battenberg and passed it to her daughter as a carrier, and 2 of her sons manifested the disease, while the daughter carrying the gene married the King of Spain and gave it to 2 of their sons. The Aunt Irene that Anastasia wanted to contact in Berlin was the daughter of Queen Victoria's 3rd child, a girl named Alice, and Irene was the older sister of Anastasia's mother by 6 years. Irene had married the Kaiser's brother Heinrich, the Prince of Prussia, and Irene gave the gene for hemophilia to 2 of their 3 children, all sons, and 2 of them suffered from the disease. Irene's youngest boy died at age 4 after bumping his head, and Irene had been 52 years old when they killed the Tsar and his wife. Irene's younger sister, Alexandra, who was 46 years old when the family was murdered. And Irene denied Anastasia's identity because she wanted to please the rest of the family, but she would suffer all her life from severe histrionics whenever the death of the Tsar was mentioned. Irene's second son had escaped the hemophilia gene, and he believed that Anna Anderson was the same person he'd known in childhood, and they had been born 4 years apart. And this second son turned his back on the whole lot of them and went off to Costa Rica with his wife in 1927 to grow coffee and bananas. Irene's husband died on Hitler's birthday in 1929 at the age of 66. And her eldest son died on the day before the Cap Arcona was sunk in 1945, and Irene blamed the Americans for his death because the blood transfusion that could have saved his life on the 2nd of May had been diverted to concentration camp victims by the Americans instead of having been made available to her son. A musical about the exiled Russian nobility, called Tovarish, came out in 1963, starring the woman who had played Scarlet in the movie Gone with the Wind in 1939. And it said, "Nichivo, we are Russian, and we were born to suffer. No one knows suffering better than I. I had a navy, he had a navy, the nicest navy you have ever seen. Such lovely cruisers, and what destroyers, and my own private submarine. Oh, I've tried to put my Navy days behind me. I don't go near the river past the dike, but something always happens to remind me, like children with their sailboats in the park. Hey, hey, Nichivo, hey, hey, Nichivo, who wants to sit around and cry? Hey, hey, Nichivo, just say Nichivo, you can be happy if you try. I had a stable, oh, such a stable, you'd see my thoroughbreds at every track. I loved those horses, how he loved horses, and they all seemed to love me back. Oh, their photographs are spread around my room now. Yvette, Yvonne, and Boris who went flying. And though I make my living with a broom now, as long as I'm near horses, I don't mind. Hey, hey, Nichivo, hey, hey, Nichivo, who wants to sit around and cry? Hey, hey, Nichivo, just say Nichivo, you can be happy if you try. I was a dancer, a ballerina, the Tsar himself attended my debut. He brought me flowers and stayed for hours. It was a fairy tale come true. He called me his Marouche, I called him Nicky. We had a little palace all our own. But Nicky overlooked the Bolsheviki. Oh, Nicky, did you have to lose the throne? Hey, hey, Nichivo, hey, hey, Nichivo, who wants to sit around and cry? Hey, hey, Nichivo, just say, Nichivo, you can be happy if you try. Russia had been on the forefront of fighting the Islamists in the Ottoman Empire for as long as Islam had begun to attack Christianity, and the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856. And in the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856, the Islamic Turks had been allied with Britain, France, and Sardinia against the holy mission of Mother Russia. But France negotiated with the Tsar in secret for a peace deal, so the British beat them to it by signing a separate peace with Russia. To protect the Russian Orthodox Christians in Turkey being persecuted by Muslims in 1854, Nicholas I had sent the Black Sea Fleet to Constantinople, and France had sent their fleet to protect the Christians in the Holy Land, and Britain had sent its fleet ostensibly to help France. And the British marched into Turkey with flags flying, but the supply ships not arriving became a real problem. And after the charge of the Light Brigade, things went from bad to worse as a storm sank the rest of the supply boats and blew away all their tents. Russia had been on the forefront of fighting the Islamists in the Ottoman Empire for as long as Islam had begun to attack Christianity. And in the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856, the Islamic Turks had been allied with Britain, France, and Sardinia against the holy mission of Mother Russia. But France negotiated with the Tsar in secret for a peace deal, so the British beat them to it by signing a separate peace with Russia. To protect the Russian Orthodox Christians in Turkey being persecuted by Muslims in 1854, Nicholas I had sent the Black Sea Fleet to Constantinople, and France had sent their fleet to protect the Christians in the Holy Land, and Britain had sent its fleet ostensibly to help France, and the British marched into Turkey with flags flying, but the supply ships not arriving became a real problem, and after the charge of the Light Brigade, things went from bad to worse as a storm sank the rest of the supply boats and blew away all their tents. A storm sank the rest of the supply boats and blew away all their tents. The Ottomans' prime enemy had always been Russia, while Britain was the Ottomans' best friend, and Britain would take the lead in winning the Crimean War for the Ottoman ally at great cost to both the British and the French. And after winning the first Battle of Alma, the British stopped to drink out of the Alma River while still under fire, but the water was not fit to drink, and then came the worst winter in Crimean history. First came dysentery, and then came cholera, and opium was effective against both, and half the British army died that winter. So Florence Nightingale came to the battlefield to pass out opium, and she herself was a user. Germany was fighting with Denmark over Hanover, and Austria and France joined in. And Prussia and Austria defeated Denmark in 1864, but in dividing Hanover, they disagreed about the final borders, and the ensuing Austro-Prussian War of 1866 would be won by Prussia. The German-speaking territory of Hanover would then be ruled by Prussia until the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, where Bavaria joined with Prussia to emerge victorious over France in 1871. The genius behind the Franco-Prussian War was Otto von Bismarck, who united Germany and began the Second Reich. and Germany would then be the primary power in Europe until the Great War in 1914. Serbia had revolted against the Muslim Turks who were massacring Christians in the Balkans, specifically Russian Orthodox Christians, and Disraeli was a British Jew who sided with Turkey. And when Russia declared war on Islamic Turkey in 1877, the Ottomans sued for peace in January of 1878 after the British fleet had failed to arrive in Constantinople. The Treaty of San Stefano would be signed in March, and Britain had opposed the Russian presence in the Balkans and would swap out the treaty that summer with the Treaty of Berlin, with Bismarck leading the negotiations, and Bosnia was given to Austria, even though it would not be formally annexed until 1908. Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and Bulgaria banded together in 1912 to form the Balkan League, and they fought the Muslim Turks in the First Balkan War, and then fought the Muslim Turks in the Second Balkan War in 1913, and Bulgaria attacked Serbia and Greece to chase them out of Macedonia, and Romania allied with the Turks to beat the Bulgarians, and both Turkey and Bulgaria would join with Austria and Germany for the Great War. These battles coincided with improvements in railroads, and it had become military policy to ship troops by railway that could now be achieved in the hundreds of thousands. Russia was busy flushing out Jews who had been siding with the Ottoman Muslims, and France was making friends with Muslims in French Morocco. So when Germany blamed Jews for their part in negotiating the Treaty of Versailles after the Great War, it wasn't much of a stretch for Stalin to sympathize with Hitler, especially after Trotsky's betrayal of the motherland after the death of Lenin. The Crimea had been the first time the Ottomans were decisively beaten back, and the Hungarians had merely kept them at bay, but the Russians truly put the fear of God into them. And when the Crimean War came along, the Turkish Muslims were occupying the Holy Land where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built over the tomb of Jesus. And the Muslims had been lording it over some Latin monks who were taking care of the home of the Virgin Mary and the place where Jesus was born in Bethlehem. These monks had been there since the days of the Crusades, when Christian warrior knights had founded the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And the Muslims had allowed these places to remain standing, lest the Crusaders return. Most tourists to the Holy Land came from Russia, and wanted their Greek Orthodox religion to take care of these places. And the Russian Orthodox in the Holy Land outnumbered the Roman Catholics by 100 to 1. Russian Orthodox saw Constantinople as their authority, while the Latin monks were taking their orders from France. And Russia needed to rule Turkey if the holy places were to be kept safe for Russians, and on the 30th of November in 1854, Russia sent the Black Sea Fleet to Constantinople and sank the Turkish navy. And because France and Britain had so many French and British in Turkey, the war was on. Shiploads of cholera cases poured in continuously from Varna, but there was no means of sheltering them, much less of providing medical attention. Active troops and sick were alike starving. If food had existed, there was no means of cooking it. It was a well-known fact that timber did not exist in the Crimea, and every root of every bush had been grubbed out of the ground for fuel. Queen Victoria, page 358. It was Russia herself, the huge distances, the ferocious climate, which destroyed invader and defender impartially. Countless multitudes of the Tsar's subjects perished transporting shells to Sevastopol, which must be carried 350 versts, 230 miles, on the backs of bullocks, since railways did not exist, of the armies which marched to the defense of Sevastopol in the Crimean campaign. In all probability, only 1 man in 10 arrived. Queen Victoria, page 373. The fight between Britain and Russia over the Muslim question was called the Great Game, and had been going on long before Hitler made friends with the Grand Mufti. But it had been at that point that the hostility reached new heights because, having turned their back on God in the days of Henry VIII, the British Crown could no longer afford to have any fear of opposing their creator, lest they be crushed in the attempt. So the power brokers behind the Crown pretended to themselves that the Islamics were on equal footing with the Christians, and thereby deserved to be defended as an equal player on the world stage. Mostly the British thought they could use the Muslims to the benefit of the Crown, while America was a Christian nation and had no choice but to side with Russia in the Great Game. There was no question for Christians about whether Islam should be allowed to keep their thumb on the Holy Land. And from January to July in 1943, the U.S. would ship to the motherland 4,100 planes and 138,000 motor vehicles, as well as shiploads of steel and industrial machinery for Russian arms factories, and part of the equipment went by northern convoy to Archangelsk, a city on the White Sea named after its monastery of Michael the Archangel, and part of it went in Russian ships to Vladivostok, and the rest through Iran to the Caspian Sea, and the shipments through Iran increased to 100,000 tons a month by July of 1943. Hitler knew he had a friend in Stalin, because when the Jew communists had been stirring up trouble in the year of revolutions in 1848, the Russian Tsar had sent 80,000 Russian soldiers into Hungary to put a stop to the rebellion and help the Austrian nobility keep their estates, and it took 3 months to end the uprising, while the mostly Jewish leaders escaped to Turkey. When Stalin took over in Russia after Lenin died, Trotsky's international Jews were purged from the motherland, and that campaign had turned Stalin into a nationalist. Churchill gave his anti-Russia speech at Fulton, Missouri, in the spring of 1946, where he demanded a boycott of Mother Russia using the phrase "Iron Curtain" that he had gotten from the Germans. But instead of crippling America, the Great Cold War would make American industry boom. And the Cold War would also keep British submarines from blowing up Washington, D.C. with an atom bomb. So many advanced Russian and American submarines had been put into the water that who would know from whence the missile had come? Operation Unthinkable had been a British plan slated to begin on the 1st of July in 1945 by attacking Russia 4 days before the election in Britain. And that would have guaranteed a win for Churchill as he continued to carry the banner of an active war. But Kim Philby and his Gang of Five had been keeping Stalin informed, and even with the Americans leaving Europe to go fight Japanese in the Pacific, there simply weren't enough Germans left to stop the Russians. So without the Americans agreeing to Unthinkable, there was no way for it to have succeeded. Kim Philby had been named after Rudyard Kipling's daring adventurous hero in Kipling's novel about the Great Game in Afghanistan. And Kim Philby had come from the British upper class and was both a journalist and an entrenched intelligence agent. And as a newspaperman, Kim Philby had many contacts on both sides of the Great Game, and had become Russia's best friend well before Hitler's war. Kim Philby chose sides not just to spy against the British, but because he was seriously sympathetic to Russia's plight. And in June of 1941, Kim Philby had been able to assure Stalin that Japan would not attack Vladivostok, and that had made it possible for Stalin to defend himself against Barbarossa rather than having to send Soviet troops to the Pacific. And Japan had not attacked Russia at Vladivostok because the American fleet at Pearl Harbor would have been able to come to the aid of the motherland. Wealthy Russians fleeing communism in 1917 sent their children to British schools where Kim Philby and his friends would sit around comparing the communist dream to its direct opposite embodied in the British Empire. And Arthur Kessler, who wrote Darkness at Noon, said, "Every page of Marx and even more of Engels brought a new revelation and an intellectual delight, with the intoxicating effect of a sudden liberation from the rusty chains with which a pre-1914 middle-class childhood had cluttered one's mind. Today, when Marxist philosophy has degenerated into a Byzantine cult and virtually every single tenet of the Marxist program has become twisted round into its opposite, it is difficult to recapture that mood of emotional fervor and intellectual bliss." The God That Failed, edited by Richard Crossman, New York, Bantam Books, Harper & Row, 1950-1965, page 16. Kim Philby had ridden his motorcycle to Vienna in the fall of 1933, and he had rented a room and fallen in love with the landlord's Jewish daughter. And because Nazis were going around breaking Jewish heads at the time, Kim Philby had become an ardent anti-Nazi, and he also became a communist, because at the time, politicals had those two choices, either Hitler or Stalin, and all other opinions were washed away by that tidal wave. Austria was still suffering from the effects of losing her empire after the First World War. The country rapidly became crippled by inflation. Eric Gedai, Times correspondent in Vienna at this period, writes in his book Fallen Bastions, quote, "In the decayed salons of inflation-battered Vienna, one walked across oriental rugs to dine off costly plate on a little cold sausage and black bread beneath the eyes of old masters. Such privations might have endured indefinitely. The Czechs, Slovaks, Romanians, Yugoslavians, and Hungarians, intent on maintaining their recently celebrated freedom, had no intention of offering aid to the Austrian economy, only to see a return of the hated Habsburgs. As far as the rest of Europe was concerned, Austria could go on adding zeros to its notes and dining off dry bread and acorn coffee." An Austrian writer who had moved to Britain met Kim Philby at a party, the sort of gathering all young, energetic intellectuals flocked to, and described Philby, quote, "He was a shaggy, bumbling Englishman, overwhelmed by the passions swirling around him. To what extent he shared them, I don't know. Certainly he talked, but more often he listened," close quote. The Philby Conspiracy by Bruce Page et al. New York, Doubleday and Company, Inc., 1968, page 54-7. After the Great War, Americans were helping Austria with financial aid because they needed help so badly, and Austria was so poor and small that the American loans were welcomed. But as Austria began to get back on its financial feet, those with the new money were afraid that the communists would take it away from them, and their fears were not unfounded, and late-night political street fights began in Austria just as in Germany. Kim Philby wanted to fight those who were hunting down Jew communist sympathizers like Philby's Hungarian Jewish girlfriend. And when Philby married her, British intelligence would call her, quote, "that communist wife," close quote, as a slur. In the summer of 1927 in Vienna, a gang of thugs hired by some rich people left almost 100 communists dead and a courthouse burned down, and Philby began to drink too much and went to Russia, where drinking to excess was more acceptable. Kim Philby would write a book in Russia called My Silent War that everyone took seriously because they needed someone to blame for why the Russians were always so good at guessing what the British and their fellow travelers were planning. A leader of the Polish resistance during Hitler's war named Sikorsky had also been sympathetic to Russia because he was a member of the Polish Socialist Party. And Sikorsky had been eager to bargain with Stalin over Poland, and after he'd gone to Paris and to London, trying to get the Allies to help him make deals with Stalin, Sikorsky's plane exploded after takeoff from Gibraltar on the 4th of July in 1943, killing his daughter and 90 other people, and Kim Philby had been stationed at Gibraltar when the plane took off. That winter of 1943, FDR sent more FBI and OSS to work with the British, which meant keeping an eye on the Anglophiles among the CIA/OSS. And when the Germans were getting ready for the Bulge in the fall of 1944 and were busy making preparations for the end of the war, the German general in charge of breaking through to Monty had executed American POWs at Malmedy because he'd been supremely confident in a German victory where no questions would ever be asked, and civilians at Stavelot had also been executed for helping the Americans. Kim Philby had been the director of Britain's new Soviet department in 1944, and Philby had worked enthusiastically to sabotage the peace negotiators in the 20th of July plot in 1944, and the separate peace might have happened but for Philby's love for his Jewish commie wife, and Britain and Germany would have won Hitler's war instead of the United States of America emerging victorious, and Philby would write in his fictional novel My Silent War, My Silent War, just to stick his thumb in the British establishment's eye after his friend Sikorsky's plane had crashed. The book My Silent War would be published in 1968, with an introduction by Graham Greene, who had been busy smoking opium in Vietnam, and Kim Philby had been sent to Constantinople in the summer of 1946 to work as a Russian double agent, while the OSS were being shut down to re-emerge in 1947 as the CIA. More than a few Anglophile Americans were drawn into the CIA, and Philby was sent to America in 1949 as a first secretary to the British Embassy in Washington, and he served as chief British liaison with American intelligence agencies, and from that posting was able to send plenty of secret information to the Soviets from his job in America. When Churchill's plan for the Balkans had fallen through, when the Americans had gotten in the way, the SAS would start it up again by dropping commandos into Albania in 1947, and the SAS attacked police stations and sabotaged the Kukova oil fields and the Rubik copper mines. But after 2 years of this dirty work, there were still no natives willing to join the British in rising up against the Albanian government. Kim Philby had been the co-commander of the SAS commandos in Albania, and more subversives were recruited from Egypt and trained in Cyprus and dropped into Albania in 1950, along with a contingent of Anglophile CIA. And more commandos came from Malta and Germany. But the Russians always seemed to know they were coming. Their last raid to conquer Albania was on Easter in 1952. And that plan failed when the Russians knew not only when and where the British commandos would arrive, but had also learned all their secret codes. Philby was delighted to share the atomic energy dispute with the Russians, and had Philby not shared the intimate details of America's nuclear capability with the Russians on an ongoing basis, the Russians would have felt threatened and paranoid. In 10 years' time, he may be stopping British tourists in the Moscow streets. Imagine that leaky eye and whiskey voice, that hesitant, soft-footed charm. "Britain is fascist, you know," he will say. "That's why I had to do it." The Philby Conspiracy, page 16. 8 September 1944, Queen Mary. We have been traveling in the Gulf Stream all day and consequently living in a Turkish bath of hot clamminess. We began with a short COS, Chief of Staff, and at 12 noon had a meeting lasting till 1:30 with the PM. He looked old, unwell, and depressed, evidently found it hard to concentrate, and kept holding his head between his hands. He was quite impossible to work with, began by accusing us of framing up against him and of opposing him in his wishes. According to him, we were coming to Quebec solely to obtain 20 landing ships out of the Americans to carry out an operation against Istria, coast of Slovenia, to seize Trieste, and there we were suggesting that with the rate at which events were moving, Istria might be of no value. War Diaries, Allenbrook, page 589.